The three-headed monster raged and roared, baring its ferocious teeth as it unleashed havoc all around. It was truly a sight. The beast unleashed a huge blast, fast and terrifying, that broke through various nearby buildings. It was actually really sucky that things would turn out this way again, and this was the worst. The man immediately commanded Sergeant Kim Si to take the children away from there, and many spirits had already arrived to spirit away the last girl. The Wind Sergeant did not need to be told twice, and the hero charged forward, yelling that they needed to stop the final sacrifice no matter what. The vampire bat watched the man come closer in alarm, and she gritted her teeth at the wind spirits, asking who told them to do that. The item being used now was Sir Tristan's fail not to attack a target without fail, and the hero fired at that pesky vampire who started dodging all over the place. She was a really exhausting villain, and he did not want to put up with her consistently. She was also confused and wondered what was going on with the insane arrow that followed her no matter how hard she tried to dodge. The fool could not escape and got pierced by the glowing blue-pointed object that dove into her chest, and she fell to the floor with a thud. While the hero distracted her, the female sergeant made away with the last sacrifice, having secured the only survivor from the incident. The other two children turned out to be expendable fodder, huh? Well, the vampiress was still raging and hissing that the resistance of the stupid soldiers was futile, and with Cerberus summoned, it was now over for Syl. They could not change anything as she had already killed two children, and she seemed hellbent on taking one more own with her. She was such a troublesome woman. The hero ignored or activated the crown of light and darkness that appeared like a halo over his head and granted an aura to specified equipment. Lee Hunwook was determined not to lose at a place like this, and he declared that he would, in fact, take Cerberus down and save Seul. No matter what her horrible plans were, he would stop them. That was his oath as a hero. The man then unleashed his Saint Aura and got a buff activated. To her horror, the arrow within the vampire's bosom began to spark and twist, and it bubbled with divine fire that had the horrible witch screaming in pain. This plan that Hyunwook had was a gamble, and he could not execute all of his missions without losing any people. He had to know that by now, as he had learned a lot from his past life. Even so, it could not be helped that he took losses like this to heart. No matter how many times he went through it, he could not bear it. So, no matter what, he had to make this work. The hero was fired up, and the dark Cerberus beast kept howling at the moon like no tomorrow. It was quite a demonic creature, trying desperately to tear itself from the portal, and they received a warning that Cerberus had torn a rift in their world and was now attempting to enter. They surely could not allow that to happen. He then yelled that it would not be best to bash the dog's head in like the sergeant had done before with the Dockaby goblin from last time. Well, they had stopped the last sacrifice from taking place, so it had not been properly summoned. However, right now they needed to find this beast's weaknesses and then use that against it. The Wind Sergeant wondered if they could even find the weakness for a creature like that with so limited time. Even if they did find it, what were they supposed to do with that information? That fierce beast was getting even fiercer, and the worst part was that it seemed like more and more of its head was managing to break through the outlet. Now all three heads were very visible, and it would not stop its incessant roaring. It was rather annoying. The redhead paladin raised her head and took note of the gatekeeper of hell trying to tear its way into their world. That could not be a good sign, and she was alarmed to see it. Even the soldiers were quite alarmed to see such a horrendous beast trying to enter their world. To absolutely everyone's horror, Cerberus broke free and leaped right from the portal. That awful demonic creature managed to make its way into Seul, and the hero gritted his teeth, saying that he had prepared for something like this a long time ago. Now he would make it work no matter what. No matter what he had to sacrifice, he would have to overcome this beast. The great beast roared as it leapt from the top of that giant building, freeing itself from the portal above. The creature then began to charge up even more bombs to shoot out because just its ugly appearance was not enough. It also had to have a very ugly attitude. This was the source of erosion boss monster named Cerberus, and the spark from the bomb that it was summoning was so large and wide that the entire surrounding area was lit up in pink lighting. The Wind Sergeant panicked to see such a beast walking among them, and she asked if Hyunwook was sure that they could do something about such an evil, ugly beast. That thing looked like the absolute worst, but they did not have time to panic, and she asked the hero to get started and do his best. Naturally, he was going to do his best anyway, and he called out to the steel company, telling them that they would have to activate Plan B now. They would use the lightning rod plan to fight the boss. The soldiers listened as their platoon commander and Jun-mo were instructed to move to Point A. Both were a little shocked by this command. All other company members were to begin deploying the weapons that they had strategically kept in crates, and the men moved quickly, working as one unit to get the plan working. Then, Park Jun-mo was the key to this operation. and he could die if things went south, but the hero asked if Jun-mo would still trust his orders. Of course, Jun-mo immediately said yes. Mass from the Mowgli fragment had been sealed, and the giant sword was activated above the giant sparking monster. Cerberus seemed generally unimpressed at the sudden appearance of the giant sword, but that was alright as it suddenly grew even bigger, piercing through the floor and shocking the giant beast. The creature was so huge that its paws tossed aside cars like they were nothing but toys. The staff of the fallen elf lay on the ground, but it began to glow blue because Lee Won-suk had picked it up at his sergeant's orders. Now, the hero told the big guy to move along with the attack platoon's commander. The big guy was surprised that he was supposed to leave the hero and the survivors there. The hero had charged up the staff with some kind of magic, and the landscape outside had become very deadly with the three-headed dog prowling around like a mad thing underneath the purple sky that summoned it. This place with the altar just so happened to be safer than any other place in Seoul, especially with Cerberus out and about, plus, Sergeant Choi would not be asleep for too long, and they could not afford the distraction of his attacks. So, he needed both Lee Won-suk and Kim Si-hee to hurry. They had to quickly take care of this mad dog before he got used to his surroundings. The monster roared with its head back, a giant raging beast with many rows of teeth. The redhead spoke into her communication device as she watched the beast rage from a safe distance, and the herp asked the platoon commander if she could hear his message. He needed her to take Cerberus' attention away from there with Private Lee Won-suk. The redhead was absolutely shocked to hear that Won-suk was alive. However, the hero made her focus on the mission by reminding her that during the attack, she could not let the enemy see his movements. The redhead was hesitant, asking if she could trust Lee Han-wook, and the hero said that he would definitely not let her down. Then, the platoon commander agreed. Though she did not know what he was doing, she knew that she could always count on him to bring results, so she was leaving it to him. The redhead then activated her awesome superpowers, golden feathers dancing all around her. Meanwhile, Hyun-wook told Private Lee Won-suk to watch his back as he was about to do something very risky. The big guy was a little nervous about this situation, but it wasn't like he could back down now, so he encouraged the man to leave it to him. Won-suk was fired up and ready to defend, so the hero ran ahead, calling out to Kim Si-hee. It was time for them to move forward, and the hero leapt, soaring through the air as he made some pretty big decisions really quickly. He had finally put together a team that could pull their own weight instead of everyone relying on him all the time, so things would go so much more smoother than before. As he fell, a hand grabbed him from the air. It was, of course, Kim Si-hee who would see to it that he got to the ground safely. Lightning sparked around the area, and the soldiers braced themselves for the battle ahead. The three-headed beast continued to spark and sparkle, a monster in every sense of the word, as it stood there emitting terrible purple lightning. The beast intended to wreak more havoc, but Won-suk launched the first attack against it with the paladin backing him up. They both leapt at the creature together, swinging their mighty weapons full of power. The two could not afford to waste any energy or any strike against the beast, and they brought down their weapons at the same time on different heads. The paladin's mighty sword was strong steel that could pierce through almost everything it encountered. But the monster's head was too thick, even Won-suk could not get through. It seemed all they had served to do was further enrage the nasty monster that sparked even more than before. The paladin's eyes widened as she stared into that mass of overwhelming power, and Won-suk cried out as well at the sparking thrown back by the failed attack, as the monster widened its maw to let out a deafening roar. The creature's other head also tossed back the red-headed paladin, who had to fall off its unscarred head. As all this happened, Si-hee and Hyun-wook grew closer to their targets. The gatekeeper of hell, Cerberus, was now casting some hellish magic, and it was about to use wide area magic. That was so annoying and unacceptable. So, the beast could still use something like that, even while it was still unstable. Dark clouds began to gather and purple lightning sparked from above as the monster prepared to strike, and its power charged up, the monster opening all of its mouths to bring down chaos on the world. It was a frightful thing, and that portal that bubbled above it was inky blank and foreboding, supplying the creature with more and terrible power. However, it was the other way around, and the monster actually shot its power upwards to create the black inky hole. Now the hole bubbled, and then unleashed a giant, terrible strike, so blinding and powerful that it looked like it could rip the world in two. The paladin watched it approach in horror, and Won-suk also gaped in shock. There was a huge blast above them, and the others flinched. Even the hero was shocked at the huge power that the creature was able to summon. Still, Jun-mo stayed steady, because this was apparently part of the plan, and he seemed to channel the dark energy coming from that blast into the weapon that he held. That power that was supposed to strike down those below was redirected to a place that the hero had chosen, and Han-wook wondered if Jun-mo could really withstand such a huge hit. The young officer was doing a lot for their cause in holding back the intensity of that attack, and the poor man sparked with so much energy as he fought alone, absorbing the chaotic energy before it could do damage to anyone else. The hero called out to Park Jun-mo in worry, and the other man screamed in agony. The Old-O Middle School was currently being used as a temporary shelter, and back then, Jun-mo had gasped when the sergeant had handed him the legendary Cloud Blade. He then asked why this was being given to him. The sergeant explained that he was just having the boy hold on to that for now, and then asked if the young officer was really going to do what he asked. Of course, the man was ready. He said that weaklings like him should surely do whatever it took to get stronger. Lee Han-wook was very grim as he explained the situation that they faced, letting the youth know that if they failed, then the man could die. The young Jun-mo held the weapon even tightly in his hands. He understood the weight of the role that he had been given. His whole life, he had lived in obscurity, and the life of a loser was not worth living. Not exactly the kind of moral lesson that anyone wants to push. But regular players could level up and grow through combat. However, Hyun-wook and Jun-mo were special out of level growth players, which meant that they had to find their own unique way to grow with nothing to guide them. The sergeant had already tried his best to help Jun-mo and his electric attribute, but every attempt had ended in failure, and it almost felt like the youth was just not cut out for this kind of thing. However, right now, they really needed him, and he expressed that he would not live like a loser anymore. There was a fire in the youth's eyes, and the sergeant stared at him, knowing that there was only one method left to try. Corporal Park Jun-mo would now take this into his hands. He was fully prepared, and he said that he would live up to the standards that had been set by his kind Sergeant Lee Han-wook. Thinking about it, the hero could not really remember Park Jun-mo from his last life because the young man had died early. The man now worried that this gamble would not pay off, and he could be wrong. If that was the case, he wondered if he could really be responsible for this young man's death. It was a lot to ask and even harder to watch that giant bolt of volts, all throbbing and dancing as one, connect to Jun-mo, who stood alone at the top of a high tower. The man screamed in agony, and heavy levels of regret set in Hyun-wook. The top of that building was lit up like a firework display, a brilliant streak of purple light through the sky. And the hero yelled out encouragements to Park Jun-mo. Deep inside his heart, our guy hoped that the youth would endure. The lightning sparked so fiercely that it knocked off the man's helmet, and he had since fallen to his knees. Still, he kept his arm up, channeling that great power. His helmet fell to the ground, and the boy screamed, his eyes looking like empty sockets, but still he persevered. Still, the brunette with curly hair remained where he was. The corporal was not about to give up so quickly. Hyun-wook still watched, begging for Jun-mo to please hang on just a little longer. This plan was crazy, excessive and painful, but it just might work. The light in the sky eventually fizzled out, the sparks reducing in intensity until it faded away. This was when a screen popped up to congratulate Jun-mo for discovering how to level up his ability. He now had 9 seconds left to absorb the electric current. After that, the amount of electricity that he could control would increase fivefold. The youth remained on his knees, absorbing the very last fragments of that electric attack, his expression set in a serious determination, even as his whole body sparked. The 9 seconds passed, and Jun-mo was congratulated for unlocking self-levitation. Now he could levitate 5 meters above the ground. The young corporal threw back his head and screamed, roaring in victory and joy, and the blueonette grinned in triumph to see his little boy grow. It was exactly what he had hoped to achieve. The effects of the magic clouds of hell had been absorbed by a mysterious player, and had not inflicted damage on anyone besides Jun-mo. The purple lightning that sparked and fizzled now came from Jun-mo himself, and the young corporal stared at himself in amazement. He was a light in colors of purple, and he cheered, calling out to his sergeant Lee Hyun-wook. Jun-mo had done it, he could feel power coursing through his body, and he realized that this must be what it felt like to grow. The corporal had tears in his eyes, for he had struggled for so long without any significant growth, and that had hurt so much. Now that the youth had been awakened, the stage was set for the defeat of Cerberus. Just then, the lieutenant popped out of one of his portals, asking Hyun-wook exactly what had happened. There was no time to explain, however, so he just told the sergeant to go with Sergeant Sehi to prepare to open a warp in the sky. The lieutenant was both shocked and horrified as he received yet another ridiculously ludicrous and difficult request. He was of the opinion that Hyun-wook should be helping the assault platoon leader. However, the blueonette explained that Jun-mo blocked the area of effect magic, and he was sure that the platoon leader and Won-suk could buy enough time. Meanwhile, he was going to go ahead and tame these goodies in the meantime. The sergeant hopped into a truck and got to work on some special items that he had ordered for this occasion. The machine came alive and began the link with the Hunted Armor's black magic. Now the man could use the Hunted Armor's magic once they were linked. There was a warning that the caster of the link would indeed be consumed with black magic while being linked to the armor, so that was a risk that he would have to take. As he expected, the armor would not be tamed so easily, and dark purple lines already started growing over his face, trying to corrupt him. The man quickly activated his aura skill of a saint to counter the effects of that darkness that was trying to infect him. His halo returned, and the devilish angel grinned in triumph, saying that he had his own ways of victory. Now, he would utilize metal bedding. Reaching out his hand that glowed with magic, he touched upon the armor, bending it to his will. Meanwhile, the great beast Cerberus was not so happy with its plan to electrify the place, getting tossed up in smoke like that, and one could even say that it immediately sought revenge. Easily, the ugly creature located where the source of its attack had redirected to, and it found Jun-mo. The ugly giant creature still had a bit of fire left in its arsenal, and the fire head opened its large mouth to release a ball of flame. However, Wonsuk was unafraid of the ire, and he came charging in, determined to stop the beast no matter what. That one ball of gathered fire energy was huge, and Jun-mo felt greatly intimidated by such a nuclear blast coming so close. Wonsuk yelled for that scared loser to duck, and he swung his giant weapon, aiming the staff at the huge monster and slicing accordingly. Wonsuk glanced back, gritting his teeth when the monster fired anyway, scorching a hot and burning path through the atmosphere as it unleashed its fire blast. Even from a distance, the heat of that attack could be felt, and some part of the city was set on fire. Jun-mo fell flat on his butt, and the most important thing about this was that he had not been hit by the fire, and he was safe. This pleased Wonsuk greatly, and he laughed with joy, saying that he was going to be the next player here. Suddenly, the monster's giant paw appeared above him, and the big vampire was slammed right into the ground. He had clearly started boasting a bit too early, and the poor guy now spat out blood for his folly. Things were looking bleak for the big guy, but that was the moment that Golden Wings appeared on the horizon. It was the dawn of the Golden Paladin, a wonderful addition to the fight as she activated her divine and holy wings. The monster roared, trying to understand what it was faced with. Its ugly face looked like it was leaking as the Golden Wings drew close. As the monsters of destruction that they were, the monster immediately tried to bite the wings, knowing nothing but violence. Wait, those terrible monsters were onto something, because those large and sharp demonic teeth actually succeeded in shattering the golden wings that had attacked. The paladin was absolutely shocked that such an evil, vile and undead creature was still able to do damage to her holy weapon. The lady had used all of her mana on those holy wings, yet they had not been enough. She almost could not believe it. This monster they faced was far out of their league, and it roared in anger and annoyance, still trying to snatch the heroes into its jaws. The redhead put her all into dodging, but the creature followed her everywhere. It tried to slice her with its long claws, and the beast tried to eat her up as well. Jun-mo quickly realized that the platoon commander Seo Yunho was in danger, and it would be a crime to let a beauty like that fall. Though he was hit by a moment of insecurity, when he wondered if there was anything he could do when he had just barely become awakened. The lady bounced, somehow managing to get back on her feet before she hit the ground. Even an officer like her was having such trouble against the three-headed mutt, so the corporal did not believe very much in any of his chances for success. That ugly monster from the pits turned its eyes towards the redhead, while this loser continued to monologue in his head about how he had been a loser his whole life. Still, the redhead stood tall, holding up her shield, determined to fight the beast till the very end. Seeing her like that finally reinvigorated the loser brown ender, and he clutched the weapon tight in his hands. He would surely continue to be a loser with that kind of mindset. The man launched himself from the roof, yelling out that he could definitely do it, and if he was not sure how then, he would figure it out someday. Then a warning came out that the gatekeeper of hell had finished acclimatizing to Earth. It was the worst possible scenario as the hero had waned anything but that to happen. Now the monster had gotten used to its surroundings and it was ready to unleash more of its terrible powers. The beast threw its head back, roaring out in anger, and all 6 of its eyes blazed with the promise of violence and suffering. Such a terrifying creature it was, and its hostile eyes turned red with darkness. The creature opened its mouth to reveal jaws dripping with drool and hungry to devour the earth and everything within it. The redhead was concerned as she did not even have any more holy mana, and Wonsuk had been knocked down. There was no way that she could face this beast alone. The middlehead began to prepare yet another electric charge, and all the redhead could do was raise her shield and brace for impact. The redhead stared ahead, despair in her eyes as she wondered just Thoin the hero would bring forth this trump card that he had been talking about earlier. It was terrifying to face certain death, and to meet a beast that was not even she was strong enough to beat. The creature unleashed lightning hell, and Inna stood tall. However, the bolts did not hit her as a familiar-looking weapon stretched out and made contact with had electric current, immediately devouring the power of that hit. It was Jun-mo again, and he used his arm like a lightning rod, absorbing as much of that awesome power as he could. The corporal quickly took a moment to ask the corporal if she was okay, and she stared in shock to see Park Jun-mo was the one to rescue her. The monster rained down that heavy current, but the corporal met that downpour head-on, his hand not wavering as he needed to protect the paladin. The youth told the lady that she could just hide behind him. He did not know much about electricity, but he could only hope that he could handle this much at once. Unfortunately, it seemed Cerberus was a learning beast, and he'd figured out that electric attacks were not really going to work around there. So, it opened its giant mouth and produced a fireball so large that the corporal could not help but flinch in concern. Fire was definitely a weakness to the electricity user as he had only just learnt to absorb electricity. Somehow the wicked did fire it, mixing together fire and electricity into the same channel. It was impressive, but it was still their enemy, and impressive or not, they would be better off if that monster was dead. The young corporal then told the commander to hurry and find cover. With this double combo attack, he was no longer sure how long he could keep this up. Then, the mass from the Mowgli fragment was released, and that was in the nick of time, too, because the other head was raising the beast's giant paw, and it seemed like it intended to smack Park Jun-mo. However, before that could happen, the giant sword came flying at that mangy mutt. The steel flew forward and flew true, thrown by a warrior with a golden halo around his head. This warrior seemed to tower over Jun-mo, and the commander gaped at the appearance of this warrior, immediately recognizing Hyen-wook but gaping in disbelief at his success. The corporal was amazed and joyous, happily greeting his servant who had showed up in front of them. The sergeant said that was the lieutenant CO had done quite well so far. It was now time for her to leave them then and to stand back. The sergeant bid farewell to the lieutenant. However, the sergeant then called out to Corporal Jun-mo, asking the youth if he had enjoyed himself. He also asked the young corporal if he thought that he could handle it, and the corporal confirmed that he could. Finally, the brunette could at least hold it back with her cloud blade. The villain then grinned rather wickedly and told the young brunner to keep distracting the enemy for as much as he could. The young corporal activated his maximum electrical output. The sergeant noted his consideration, but it was time for them to move ahead with the plan. The mass from the Mowgli fragments had once again been released. The hero now fought against the deadly beast with two giant swords. The young corporal charged up with all of the power that he had amassed from the great beast and just managed to shoot its shoulder. Meanwhile, our guy swung the big sword over his head, and the great monster suddenly turned its head into a hide-and-seek game of chess. The Mowgli fragment had been released, and yet another giant sword descended from above. The hero did to waste time in grabbing eye, and he launched at the beast once more, determined to at least be hated. The sword screeched against one of the thing's heads. Hyen-wook called out for the giant dog to just hurry up and die up. He also called Cerberus a coward. Purple lightning continued to spark throughout the sky, and the monstrous beast below continued to rage, casting fear into the hearts of those who fought in this hopeless and one-sided war. Not only were the humans fighting against a beast that was 10 times their size, but the beast could also charge up balls of fire and electricity. It was a pretty unfair advantage, and the whole fight screamed of unfair circumstances. The hero had tried evening up the battlefield a bit when he'd rocked up with his giant suit of armor and even bigger blade, but he cursed when he misjudged the first attack and missed. Now that Jun-mo had achieved and activated the new skill of self-levitation, he drew closer to his bellowed sergeant Lee Hyen-wook, and he blocked the very next charge of lightning that the mangy dog shot, protecting his superior officer. With this much electric charge, the amount of current that the corporal could control was increasing exponentially. Now it had increased eightfold, and if he continued like this, he would eventually unlock his hidden skills. Concerned, the corporal asked if the sergeant was okay, quickly volunteering to take care of the jerk with electricity for him. Hyen-wook was not the type to try to carry every burden, and he happily left the electric monster to his colleague while he would handle the fire, breathing, horn jerk. Naturally, the monster did not take too kindly to being underrated and unleashed its own attacks. Simultaneously, the electric head and fire head shot fire from their mouth, roaring flames attempting to consume the fire in front of them. Of course, Lee Hyen-wook had no plans of going down that easily, and he protected his face from the blast when it came. Suddenly, the Steel-born of Flames blessing skill was activated, followed by a warning to beware of dark magic erosion. The flames raged hot and powerful, an overwhelming and painful force that was just as the blue-haired man expected. If it were not for the hunted armor, he would surely have been burnt to a crisp. The dragon was very passionate about unleashing his fire. He just kept his mouth open and unleashed death. Meanwhile, one of the released fragments sailed up to the creature, and it was revealed that the Mowgli fragments had been released. The giant blade curved through the air, manifesting as a shield to block off those awful flames, and the monster was pushed back from the force of the blade. Still, it caught itself. It was not about to be outdone by a human. The creature glared, its eyes blazing in rage as it stared in anger at the youth. All their attack techniques were just not working, and none of the strikes were getting through. Naturally, such an occurrence was really frustrating, and the hero needed to find a weak spot soon to hurry and end the fight. Suddenly, his lightning officer called out and said that he was holding back his attacks somehow. The man was really sparking up there, but he was also doing majorly well. However, the man would also appreciate it if the sergeant could take the monster down in one swoop. They needed something big to take it down. Even an idiot knew that, but they did not exactly have any big thing available, and the hero wondered if Lieutenant Lee Manhe's warp was there yet. For now, things were impossible, and the sergeant had to order a tactical retreat. They would make no progress if they continued like this. Well, the beast did not seem interested in letting them get away, and it also seemed annoyed that they were preventing so much of its carnage. Suddenly, the giant thing started to run, which was not good. They could barely handle the creature when it was standing still, and now it was sprinting. Totally not good. It seemed the gatekeeper Cerberus had properly acclimated and was now accelerating the erosion, which was one thing that they did not want to hear. Fire and electricity raged through the town, and the soldiers called out to send a status report that the flames were spreading, target moving towards the bombardment zone. It seemed the large creature wanted to maximize all of the destruction that it could cause. And I was such a disaster as soldiers ran left and right to avoid getting caught up in this thing's attack. The Great Warp was finally complete, so the lieutenant could call out to Kim Si-hee to prepare the weapons. The weapons were finally prepared, and then the Lieutenant Miney called to Hyun-wook. They had only one chance and they really needed him to succeed. The warp gate appeared on top of the burning area, and the beast Cerberus was still busy attacking Jun-mo and Hyun-wook. The creature was absolutely terrible, but the electric corporal was able to continue absorbing its shock power and protecting those behind him. The man screamed out from the effort to block the attack, and the sergeant came swinine, asking him to move out of the way. The man hopped away, and the hero yelled for their plan to work already. It was already getting tiring just fighting this beast. The Mowgli fragment was released, and the large sword manifested again, landing on the ground. The toughness of the creature's skin and its speed were all above the sergeant's expectations, and naturally, that was all very frustrating. The creature was also quickly getting used to this environment, and it was getting stronger. If things continued like this, it would end very poorly for them. They needed to find its weak spot soon, but where could it be? Suddenly, the hero noticed something. Now that he was paying attention, he noticed that the horned head was protecting the incomplete head. That was right, there were supposed to be 3 sacrifices on the altar to summon the monster breathing fire, electricity, and toxic gas. However, right now, the monster was only using fire and electricity. That incomplete head that looked like a melting pot of ash had to be its weak spot. Hyun-wook surged forward, finally with a plan towards success, and he called out to Park Jun-mo, telling him that he had found the weak spot, and now he just needed the electric corporal to distract the monster. Just then, Jun-mo's current used electricity usage had exceeded the required amount, and a new hidden skill was unlocked. The electric corporal was shocked but also very pleased, and he told his sergeant to be careful as he activated his amount. Cerberus was also not the kind to back down without a fight, and he fought hard, saying that the target was 5 kilometers away from the bombardment zone. The warp gate was opened, and all officers were prepared to do what it took, until a negative report reached them. They had a problem as the drones could not reach the target altitude because of the excessive lightning strikes. The target was now 3 kilometers away from the bombardment zone, and the lieutenant cursed, telling them to just get it as high as possible. The target drew closer and closer to the bombardment zone, and the soldiers waited for their chance as Cerberus was lured into their trap. The target had finally reached the bombardment zone and the open area, which was exactly the result that they were going for. All the key players were in place, working together to bring about its downfall. All attack forces were now moving to the warp's bombardment zone. Si-hee was surprised that they were continuing with the original plan as things were, but the lieutenant said that they would just have to trust the sergeant. There was nothing else that they could do about it. They would continue the plan and move the weapons towards the warp. So, all of the weapons were moved towards the warp. As directed by the wind sergeant, the weapons flew into the warp gate, and the sergeant was lifted to the portal overhead by one of the wind sergeant's spirits. Everything and everyone was in place, from the mighty hero to all their weapons and the monster that was their target. It was time to activate the initial stealth rounds. The monster stared at the approaching man, growling in anger, and its ugly face seemed to grin up at him, but as the man watched, the deformed face was hidden underneath the fully formed face of bone. Attacks rained down on the monster from above, the bombardment unleashing hell on the frightening beast. The hero was annoyed to see that the creature was protecting its weak spot as expected, and it was too low for the surprise attack to work. So, he was determined to crush them with sheer volume of attacks. The man roared as he pulled every weapon in his arsenal and rained the steel down on Cerberus. The monster cried out in pain as the steel came down, but still it persevered and even tried to attack the hero. Despite their efforts, the attack landed short, and the hero cursed because he could none to get an angle from there. This was his last shot, and he had to make it count. The power in his hands began to charge up, and the hidden skill was uncoke. Electric breath from Jun-mo was ready to use. The creature screamed as it was suddenly raped with electricity, and the young corporal dominated the attack against the monster for a hot minute. Then, he called out to Sergeant Lee Hyun-wook to attack now. The sergeant was impressed with Jun-mo's work, saying that he never doubted him. Then he launched an attack that went straight through the white bone head and into the weak head below. The demon flame head roared in anger, spitting out flames as the hero then summoned Mowgli. Maximum release and the shard activated at once, manifesting from inside Cerberus' head and splitting the weak point as the creature roared in agony. There were irregular mana waves of unknown origin that were suspected to be a second boss monster in the area. All members of the Tayson Guild who were supporting nearby shelters were suddenly unreachable. The guild lady was frustrated, wondering what Chu Kyoyong was doing. The man was supposed to be Korea's hero, but now he was nowhere to be found. Kang Seoyun gritted her teeth in frustration, and then she turned in surprise when someone greeted her. There were many feet, and she scowled to see Chien Myago from the Black Tiger unit. However, he was more of the presidential secretary of National Gate Strategies. The man acknowledged that he had many titles, but the lady could call him whatever she felt comfortable with. At any rate, he was here to ask for her cooperation. The warrant officer, Chian Mayano, was a tactical instructor and a secretary of the National Gate Strategies. Everything besides their name was classified. Seoyun had thought that the government was focused more on protecting its own instead of taking down the waves. She sure did not hold back on criticisms and pointed out that they had done nothing to help them tackle the problem, but now they suddenly wanted their help. The secretary defended himself, saying that a country's strength was determined by its number of players. Besides, not a single wave had been defeated by man until now. The United States and China had failed their first and second attempts to take down a wave, and they had spent 10 years dealing with the consequences. If they were to try that, there was a chance that they would never recover and get conquered by another country instead. It was a good example of why the number of players in a country corresponds with its defense capabilities. By cooperation, the guild representative could easily tell that they were asking her not to do anything. However, it was the opposite, and their special forces had set out to be the first in history to defeat a wave. This was surprising, and the woman asked if the special forces rumor about that F-rank soldier was true. Indeed, the lady was correct, and the young man was finally a light at the end of this long tunnel. Seoyun could not believe what she was hearing, and she wondered if they could really turn the tide this time. The military man was confident that the situation had changed, so he would ask again. He asked if she would cooperate with them in defeating the first wave in human history. Lee Hyun-wook was on the battlefield, fighting to prove his boss right, and he activated Mowgli, releasing it in maximum mass, creating a scene so gory and so brutal that the creature seemed to implode from the inside out. Using Aura Saint, it added 10% of the crown's divine powers onto a target item and multiplied the divine effect by 5. The creature was struck 5 times by the amount of holy power on top of getting its head speared into 2, and it screamed in agony. The hero was frustrated and already quite tired of fighting Cerberus, so he begged the ugly creature to just hurry up and die. Still, the monster was, of course, trying to get in some last-minute shots. Cerberus was also rather frustrated. It was just trying to immigrate, and all these humans were in the way. It was so annoying to Cerberus. The beast's eyes smoked with rage, and the hero gritted his teeth when he saw the beast fighting till the end. It was something he could usually respect, but not when that nonsense put the lives of his crew at risk. If this was how Cerberus was going to ask, then he told the monster to dare him. He had grown as much as expected, so he could handle this much. However, the hero wondered if he could really handle the incoming weight. Metal control was activated, and the monster screamed in fury as the hero put in all of his power to decimate that resisting head. Finally, after hours of agonizing and relentless battle, the congratulations window popped up, telling them that they had defeated the gatekeeper of hell. The erosion would now decelerate rapidly and would cease as soon as they destroyed the core. The hero breathed a sigh of relief, his halo on his head, as he noted that the second source of erosion was finally clear. They had done it after hours of work, and the soldiers gathered around celebrated, having survived a terrible and ugly battle for so long. There was the shout of rejoicing and celebrating, but they were taking things way too easy. Suddenly, the hero received a warning that the hunted armor's dark magic corruption was increasing. It was time for Hyun-wook to take off his spooky clothes. The hero gritted his teeth and glanced toward the tree. It was still too early to celebrate. They had to hurry up and find that core immediately. This was no time to relax. After the nonsense that vampire lady pulled, they should have checked to make sure that she was dead. The sergeant took Jun-mo with him, and they hurried to find the core so that they could destroy it. The rest of them would find the survivors and prepare to move. The soldiers understood their command and began to pack it up. Inside of that tree was the core that they sought, and it was shattered to the relief of everyone around. Finally, the final congrats window popped up and they had destroyed the core. The erosion had ceased and all who participated would receive experience points and magic stones would appear in the areas of erosion. Lee Hun-wook stared with a serious face at the shattering core, unable to really celebrate since 2 kids had ended their lives on his watch. They still received a reward, and it was the seed of Mistiltine. Once the seed took root and grew, it would grow to be a god tree of divinity. Now that was great, and the electric corporal stared at the seed in awe. They had finally destroyed the source of deterioration, but all they got was a stick. It seemed sort of lame in comparison, but the sergeant knew what that stick really was. It was a god-killing weapon used to kill the god of light Balder. Since it was so powerful, it never dropped as a complete weapon. They would need to plant the seed to get it to sprout, and they would have to continue to look after it until it became the god tree. It was an annoying item, but it was better to have it than to let it fall into the wrong hands in his opinion. Then the corporal glanced at his boss in confusion. There was no reason for Hyun-wook to look so serious after they had successfully destroyed the source of erosion. He expected his boss to be celebrating. Jun-mo now knew how to level up as well, so all they had to do was take down the last source of erosion. Still, the sergeant knew that taking down the last source would not be easy at all. They had struggled greatly against the 3-headed Cerberus, and the monster did not even have its 3 complete heads. There would be yet another boss monster, and other monsters who had been hesitant this whole time would come flooding down as well. They could not just worry about only the gate anymore. Seoul would soon be flooded with monsters, and this was terrible news to the corporal. The sergeant then turned to Park Jun-mo and told the youth to keep the fact that he could level up a secret for now. If someone asked, he should tell them that he received a skill by completing a mission. The boy was shocked. He had waited his whole life for this moment, but now he could not even share this with his friends. The sergeant said with all seriousness that this was because Jun-mo was just not strong enough yet. If people found out that he could level up at this point, then every organization of every country and every guild would come for him. Hyun-wook understood that he wanted his team to excel, but for now, he wanted the youth to wait until he was strong enough to handle it. He recalled what it was like when he first discovered his powers, and he knew that the other guilds would kill him if they could not have him. The corporal was horrified to hear this and he quickly became sober. Meanwhile, the hell window above the world finally closed and everyone gathered could breathe a sigh of relief. The sergeant zipped up his clothes in relief, and the survivors gathered together, everyone getting prepared. Monsters would surely now appear in areas without gates from here on out, so the attack platoon leader would make a path for them with Lee Won-suk. Platoon leaders Park Jun-mo and Kim Ji-young-jin would stay behind. Everyone else besides these 3 was to go to the temporary shelter to protect the survivors. The soldiers were a little shocked to hear that, and some of them protested, asking if they would not take part in the taking down the last source of erosion. They wanted to go too. However, the sergeant reminded them that fighting was not the only duty of a soldier. There were no players in the temporary shelters, and they could not just let the survivors die. The soldiers lowered their heads in shame as they had not thought about that. Then, everyone got ready to mount up in various transport vehicles. They would leave as soon as they were all on board. Then, Kang Kang-cheol was called by Chun Myung-oh. Sergeant Hyun-wook was the one to receive the call, and he announced that he had been waiting for the man's report and asked if his request had been approved. It had been really hard for Myung because of the man's irregular request. The battalion commander had also put his job on the line as well. The Bluinet grinned as he was rather thankful for the man's obsession when it came to moments like this. They had finally gotten approval from the president, and they could now use all military armories, the presidential armory. This was great news. Then the man asked if the hero was aware that a player being able to access the weapons for an entire division had never been approved in the history of the AMT. However, Lee Hun-wook just bowed his head in thanks, telling his superior to station a caster in each armory that could cast a warp spell. The young hero had also just received permission from the Zumaner Guild to access their armory as well, and Kang Seo-yoon popped in from the Zumaner. She had some high-level players with whom they were in contact with. They were all A-rank players, and she felt that they would be of help if she were to get in contact with them. There were also some S-rank players as well. Hyun-wook interrupted the lady to tell her that if she had some plans, Then she better get them done fast because they did not have much time. The mana storm was confirmed, and the people at the information desk could not identify the source, but they knew that it was growing bigger. It was about 20 times as big as a normal gate. Kang Seoyun was shocked and wondered how such a thing could even be possible. The window that opened in the sky glowed with colors of black and gold. It would be so beautiful if it was not so terrifying. Out of the hole grew yet another ugly thing, because there could never be a world of beautiful monsters. It was a hand, a long and large red demonic hand stretching out of that hole, and when it touched upon the ground, the earth shook and trembled. To make things worse, more and more portals opened, introducing the way for more and more horrible and dastardly hands. The soldiers stared in horror at the ugly things, and even the paladin stared in horror. They had barely survived the last battle, and now this really ugly thing was manifesting out of nowhere. The black-hearted creature of the night looked like the devil itself, and its face was just as ugly as its hand, with a gaping red maw that made it look rather toothless. The king of hell, Beelzebul, was getting a bad rep yet again, and he was trying to enter their dimension. The king was also rather pissed at losing his gatekeeper. They basically killed the man's dog and created John Satan Wick. The military head did not distrust Lee Yun-wook, but he wondered if the hero could really slay this beast. The king of hell's arrival was delayed due to the incomplete erosion, but that was not going to stop the monster from trying to force its way in like a toddler struggling with its baby seat. It was a horrifying beast, and the time until its appearance was relatively 6 hours. Lee Hun-wook declared into the communicator that they could do it, and he would be the one to end the cell wave. It turned out that Young-jun worked part-time as a teacher, and his students asked if he was really going off to join the army. The children were really excited and wondered if he was really going off to find monsters, and they bet it would be really fun leveling up, just like in a game. Yes, these kids were delusional and had no idea how horrifying a real battle could be. The man even laughed at them for acting like the army was a joke. He was going off so that he could protect little brats just like them. The kids then asked if he was really going to protect them. Then why did he fail? The scene changed, and what had been a sweet and adorable scene a few seconds ago suddenly morphed to a picture from the underworld, as the sweet angelic faces morphed into dead faces of despair. Young-jun had arrived too late at the school to find all of his precious children dead. His eyes had widened in horror, and now his eyes snapped open, awake from a terrible nightmare. The officer with him quickly checked on him, asking if he was okay. The man groaned and rubbed his head, wondering where the heck he was. Before any of that, he needed to know what happened to the kids. It seemed that all of the children they had tried to save had died, except one little girl. It was a very familiar nightmare as he vaguely got the picture of the vampire lady puncturing the hearts of the other two little girls. The man was horrified and asked why Lee Yun-wook had not been able to protect all the children. Of course, it had been a surprise ambush, so the sergeant could not have done anything about an attack like that. Besides, they had a different situation to deal with at the moment, and the officer opened the door to reveal what they were facing. There were hordes of monsters dancing around and roaring, large, scary, scaled monsters running into the area to attack. They were taking advantage of the fact that the boss was gone to run rampant and ravage the area. Jun-mo was holding them back for now, but he knew that the beasts would eventually catch up. Lee Hyun-wook knew that they had no time to dance around with a few monsters, and he told the corporal to get the monsters off their back. They needed to get to the Rendezvous area on time. Suddenly, an even bigger monster showed up. It was just like the others, just bigger. The sergeant was about to do something about it, but fortunately, Won-suk showed up to solve the problem. The monster was not a big enough problem to possibly think that it could mess with them at a time like this, and the big guy hurled it away. Hyun-wook was grateful for the assist, and Won-suk cheered himself as the future ace of the squad. The big guy really had an ego when he got down to it. The fighting of the monsters continued while the cars drove straight ahead. The heroes and players had to clear the path for the vehicles of people to move unharmed so that they could make it to the safe area. The red-headed paladin was also a part of this fight, and she fought gloriously with golden feathers dancing around her. They had to hurry because Beelzebub was still struggling hard to enter their dimension. That demon was one heck of a pest, but his advent was delayed by the incomplete erosion. The great monster had its huge arms stretching from the sky to the ground, so it was quite easy to tell that the ugly thing was massive and also quite mindless in its urge for destruction. They now had about 5 hours and 30 minutes until that thing became a really big problem. There was a box. It was Young-jun's treasured box of booze, and while the officer updated him on the A-rank players gathering, the man groaned and just asked for some booze to cure his headache. The officer was surprised, so Glasses repeated himself, in no mood to joke around as he demanded his bottles. The alcohol was over there, and the sergeant got to his feet, immediately gulping down the alcohol with relief. The officer was worried as he watched Glasses, knowing that the sergeant was about to go to battle. He worried that drinking alcohol might not necessarily be the best course of action. However, Glasses just tossed the bottle aside and told the man to think of them too, since they would be heading into battle with him. However, the sergeant's grip on his weapon was now tight and sure after having some alcohol, and he said that he would go in alone. As he was now, he needed to go into battle alone as he had always done since he became an A rank. The officer was surprised and confused about that, so Yong-jun explained. All of the other fighters were just too slow after all, so they would just get in his way. That was why he went into battle alone. The other fighters just did not get it sometimes. They did not understand how scary it was to protect someone. With these words, he leapt into the fray. The man charged at all the monsters in front of him, and the monsters charged right back. However, they were no match for the A-rank hero who sliced through them in seconds as they were nothing but cannon fodder. Hyun-wook was shocked to see Sergeant Choi and asked where he was going since he could not leave formation. Glasses grinned at the hero, who had dared to lay his hands on his precious babies and told him to be silent. He was going to do what needed to be done, so he asked the other sergeant to clear a path. The sergeant called out to him to follow procedure, and just cursed when Choi did not listen to him. A military man who was bad at following orders was not the best. Ever since losing all of his students in a previous operation, Choi Yong-jun has avoided working in teams and has stuck to working alone all the time. Hyun-wook was rather frustrated about that and wondered how he was going to control a man who still suffered from heavy trauma. Meanwhile, Sergeant Choi went ahead to do whatever he wanted. He sliced and diced all of the monsters in his path, and every monster that he laid his eyes on. He was working fairly well as a one-man path, clearing machine, but he also dove around into town to identify a few people trying to escape. The man paused when he saw them, and also spotted a tiny little boy struggling to get away from a monster. The creature opened its giant maw, intending to devour the child, but children were the hero's weakness. But before it could even think of calming down, Glasses had ripped that thing in two. Without any hesitation whatsoever, that creature was gone. The man then landed, asking the little boy if he was okay. The child was shocked but not crying, almost a surprising reaction from a child, but he had probably seen many monsters in his life. At the shock of being saved, tears quickly welled up in the boy's eyes, and Glasses begged the child not to cry. The ginger looked around, wondering where the child's parents could be, but a glance to the side and the blood spilt quickly answered that question. The boy's parents were clearly dead, and like a newborn chick, the boy quickly latched onto the person who had saved his life, basically dubbing the sergeant as his new mother and father all wrapped into one. Glasses had no idea how to react to that, but he could not very well push the kid away. Only a monster would do that. Then, he asked again if the child was okay. Of course he wasn't, he'd just become an orphan after all, but looking down at the child, he got a flash of the nightmare he'd had earlier that caused his hands to shake. Still, the child clinging to him right now was alive. Yong-jun cursed his horrible memories that chased him everywhere, but he did not have time to nurse a child. The monsters were coming. Lee Hyun-wook showed up then to scold Sergeant Choi for leaving formation during an operation, and people got killed that way. Imagine the sergeant's surprise when he saw that the ginger had apparently given birth, because he had no idea whose child that was. The brunette was especially shocked since usually the ginger was scared of kids. Well, Yong-jun did not appreciate that reminder, but he mumbled that they would, in fact, be taking his new baby with them. The child had no one to protect him, and he did not feel that it was right to end the boy alone to a shelter. Now, that was the most insane thing that Hyun-wook had ever heard, and he immediately dismissed the idea. They were facing a literal demon straight from hell. They could in no way bring a child near that fight. That would be homicide on so many levels. However, Glasses insisted on bringing the child, saying that he refused his refusal. Who did he think he was, Monkey D. Luffy? At any rate, the sergeant had also seen that shelters were not safe anymore, and anything could happen. The ginger wanted his baby within sight range so that he could always watch him and protect him. Sending a child to a shelter alone would be the same as killing him, so Yong-jun could not accept that situation. Hyun-wook was still in disbelief and gestured to the giant hands that were literally popping out of the sky. They could not take a child to that war zone. If they did not take ownership of the last source of erosion, the sill was surely going to fall, and the people would fall alongside it. The orange-haired man insisted that the A ranks would be there, so it would be the safest place in Sill right now. Either way, he was not letting go of his child. They were wasting precious time with this back and forth bickering, and the hero groaned when faced with this level of delusional stubbornness. He'd had to deal with it in his past lives too, and he knew that nothing would get through to Yong-jun whenever it came to kids. Suddenly, an idea came to Hyun-wook as he stared at Yong-jun being a complete mother bear. An idea that would finally make things work. So, the sergeant agreed to take the child with them. However, the sergeant had one condition. They would take the child to the rendezvous point, and the ginger would be solely responsible for taking care of the child. One last thing, the ginger had to follow every order until they finished dealing with the Sil wave, only then would he allow it. The Bluenet had finally found a way to corral the ginger who had baby-trapped himself in a dog collar. The ginger was slightly annoyed by the terms, but it was not something that he could not work with. He agreed, and he figured he could decide whether to listen or not, but our guy was insistent. He wanted this man to follow absolutely every order, and no exceptions would be allowed. The ginger groaned, understanding that he had backed himself into a corner, and he growled that he would listen, calling Hyunwook annoying. Well, that worked perfectly for the sergeant, and his first order was for the ginger to get moving. They had to hurry in order to get to the rendezvous point on time. The ginger glanced down, trying to make the kid let go of him now. They needed to move after all. Meanwhile, the Bluenet had a very satisfied and devilish grin on his face. This would finally take care of his consistent Young-jun problem for a while, and they could advance towards that massive monster peeking from the sky. The battle between players and monsters raged on below, and players were getting knocked out left and right. The announcer repeated a warning over and over again. All the A-rank players and above were to move immediately to the rendezvous point. It seemed the monsters were also making their move to prevent that. An ugly guy laughed at the announcement, calling the whole thing a joke. They were calling an emergency gathering when there were barely any players left. It was, of course, the ugly Chu Kyo-young, leader of the Great Mountain Guild and the supposed hero of Korea. The man yawned with boredom as three large, ugly monsters gathered behind him. He was somehow even uglier than those monsters, and the hero laughed that a lot of players would never make it to that point. He smashed up the communicator, and it seemed the hero was in fact working with the monsters, and his intention was for nothing to go according to their plans. The giant hand remained protruding from the sky, like a thief trying to snatch some good from a window. While that looming monster remained an ever-present threat, most of the heroes had gathered together at the unofficial Soul Wave Response rendezvous point. Finally, the Steel Company had arrived as well, and they were greeted by a very hearty welcome, as much as could be managed during an apocalypse. Some of the gathered soldiers whispered about Lee Hyunwook being 2 meters tall, but the team had supposedly gotten rid of the source of erosion. They wondered if this was truly the legendary group. This group of heroes was a lot smaller than people expected them to be, and they gaped in disbelief as the team approached. The Steel Company presented itself, and there seemed to be only 9 members present, including the ginger's new kangaroo baby. The company reported for duty, and Hyunwook saluted the commander. The big man was absolutely thrilled to see the Bluenet, and he pulled him into a big hug, saying that he had completely believed in him. The Bluenet was still trying to be professional as he explained that the fight was not over just yet. The big guy and the sergeant stood in the light while the rest of the team was obscured in a rather foreboding shadow, but it seemed everyone had frozen because of a deafening sound. It was the sudden surprise sound of a monster arriving on the scene at their rendezvous point. The monster rode on the top of a vehicle that had no regard for human life, since so many soldiers were rushing just to get out of the way. It nearly ran over the Steel Company. The paladin stood tall, telling the soldiers gathered to prepare for battle, as they readied to strike down the beast that dared to infiltrate their camp. All the soldiers raised their weapons, and they were definitely going to fire at that audacious beast. That was until the head called out to them, and told all the soldiers to halt. That was an ally that approached, and then he told the ally to stop messing around. Of course, the stranger then stepped out of the vehicle, a smug look on his face as he said that he had just been testing to see if the troops were truly ready for battle. The man stood there, his eyes shining with a dangerous light, and the other adventurers gasped to see Chu Kyo-young of the Great Mountain Guild. The ugly dude was a big hotshot among players, and he smirked from arrogance, saying that the military was just where people train players. But it was annoying if the army brats messed with their work. The head of the military slammed his head into Kyo-young's, asking if the other man dared to insult the military, as that was a direct insult. It was like watching a beautiful blue tiger bash heads against an ugly-ass green ogre, or watching a smaller green ogre bash heads with a stubborn gorilla. The two stood there, and the guild hero threatened to show what it really meant to insult the military. The ginger was rather disgusted by their behavior and quickly covered his child's eyes, telling him not to look because it was filthy. The tiger told the guild leader to think of it as a blessing that the military was not allowed to hurt civilians, and the ugly ogre dared accuse the military man of being scared. Clearly, the beast had been sent to egg them on and waste the little time that they had left to use on preparations. It was working so well, because the ugly brute was an A-class rage baiter, but then Hyunwook showed up to yell at both of them. No one had time for this, and if Kyo-young was here to represent his guild, Then they would interpret his actions to be the position of the Great Mountain Guild. The guild leader was annoyed that a random soldier would suddenly butt into their conversation. However, the tiger leader smiled, saying that Hyunwook was, in fact, the key to getting rid of the sources of erosion. It probably was not advisable to say that in front of someone who was likely an enemy, and the tiger dude went on to say that the Blueanet would be commanding the operation to get rid of the final source of erosion too. Now this was all too much of an honor than the guild leader could take, and he asked if they were all out of their minds. Well, no one really paid attention to that guy, and soon everyone got together to plan a course of action. There were 3 gates to consider in Gangbuk, Gangnam, and Gangseo, which opened in response to the King of Hell. After a set time, the 3 gates would combine into one, and they thought that was when Beelzebub would arrive. In order to fight that massive attack, the AMT Player Alliance would arm themselves with holy weapons and bombard each gate with holy magic. That was the plan anyway. Kaoyong was pissed to hear such a well-thought-out plan. But of course, he had to throw a wrench in the idea. The ugly leader insisted that they could not destroy a gate that way, and that all they would accomplish is holding the King of Hell back for just a few seconds. The ugly man said that he wanted to hear if they had a proper plan to kill the beast above them or not. Currently, with the resources that they had, it was likely that they could not kill it, and the guild leader cursed at them, calling them crazy as he pointed his finger in rage. The sergeant had dared to summon such high-level players without having a plan and was acting like he really wanted to die. The military man told the guild man to calm down. He wanted to hear all of what Hyunwook had to say because the man did not talk just for show. To be specific, according to the Bluenet's plan, they would be fighting an unstoppable monster that could not be properly slain if its body was on the other side of the gate. However, they could still manage to amputate the body parts that came across Seul. Ugly giggled wickedly, saying that they could not kill the monster, but apparently, mutilation was definitely an option as he had heard no verbal objections. However, Kaoyong did not believe they had anything to gain from doing that, if harming the beast was even possible. Hyunwook remained rock solid in his belief, saying that he had seen parts of the body that had been exposed because of his incomplete body. They could limit the creature's movements with a magic bombardment, and if the high-ranking players were able to concentrate their attacks on that area, they could chop off its limbs and stop the advance, which would die before the complete erosion anyway. Plus, if they were able to destroy the core on top of that, then the main character was deadly sure that they would be the first in history to conquer a wave. The military man considered this option for a while, as it seemed possible. The way a person defeated a wave was not by killing the beast, but by destroying the core, which caused the erosion. However, there was just one problem, and that was that there were not enough A-rank players. The military man then asked who they needed to destroy the core if they found it, and if it was still possible. If they were to gather all the C-rank players and above who could attack it directly and take turns striking, it was possible, but it was easier said than done. The gate system had never allowed attacking monsters inside so easily. Whether it was the arm or the head, the system would make it much harder to beat them. Well, Lee Hyunwook was quite tired of the pigs whining. All he had done all day since he got there was complain, so the blue-haired sergeant was now ready to follow Kaoyong's fine idea if he even had one. He was open to any idea that would let them attack all 3 heads at once. The pompous hero laughed and stretched out his hand, saying that the Blueanet clearly had no experience at all. The Tiger Man just smirked, saying that things like experience did not matter when it came to their beloved sergeant. Well, Kaoyong was still laughing when it was revealed that the young man standing before them had led the team to clear the Red Gate and the Sil Station. He was also an F rank. Naturally, the pompous guild leader laughed and found the whole story very far-fetched. He mocked that this whole deception was getting too obvious now. The guild leader was an A rank after all, close to being an S rank, so he had a point. However, attacking all 3 targets was much too difficult because not one other A rank besides himself had shown up at the Rendezvous point, and it was likely because the ugly head had spent the entire trip here, killing them off. The main character, as well, suspected that something was off, and he asked if the man knew why such a thing had occurred. The ugly leader now scowled with a bit of worry in his face. He wondered what was up with this weirdo that was now suddenly asking direct questions like that. Kaoyong wondered just what Lee Hyunwook knew about what he had done, but quickly mouthed off that the other fighters had probably run away to hide in another location, or they had died on their way there. At any rate, there was no other option outside of attacking all 3 at once, so the guild leader offered to take one himself, then the others would figure out a way to get the rest somehow. Despite saying these encouraging words, the wicked man was sure that they could not fight him if he offered to be helpful and to protect an area by himself. It was his job to take out all of these troublesome heroes out one by one. and he planned to get to work as soon as they spread out. The ugly guild leader just kept on mouthing off like no one had ever taped his mouth together before as he tried to goad the hero. Kyoyong insisted on taking command as the representative of the Great Mountain Guild. However, Hyunwook grinned a rather mocking smile about how safe he felt if the ugly guild leader took over. Now, the sergeant had the guild master exactly where he wanted him, so he smiled, saying that they looked forward to Kyoyong's active participation. The ugly guild leader felt something was definitely wrong with the way that guy was acting, but he was not sure what. The dude was really acting rather fishy, and his smile was foreboding. They would go ahead to proceed with simultaneous attacks then, and since the guild leader had promised to be the face of Great Mountain, then the man could do them a favor, and the ugly guild leader instantly detected an incoming problem. Grinning like a devil, the sergeant laughed that in return, they would dictate each step of the army and the guild. So, they quickly began the raid with soldiers moving out to Gangbuk, and the team was ready and in position to attack. In Gangnam, one hand had appeared, and the common townspeople gathered nearby with their own weapons drawn, also ready to flee at a moment's notice. Team 2 was also strategically positioned and ready to attack. Meanwhile, Team 3 gathered in Gangzhou and stared in horror at the creature's head. Facing the demon's ugly face was exactly where Lee Hunwook had sent Strike Team A, consisting of Chu Kyoyong, their likely deserter, platoon leader Lee Mimi, Sergeant Lee Hunwook, and Sergeant Kim Si. Jun-mo, Sergeant Choi and Seo Yunha made up Strike Team B. Right before Youngjun had left for battle, he told his little baby boy to listen to the soldiers and not to get separated from the adults. Lee Hunwook had stood in the meeting room, meeting the eyes of and enrapturing anyone who put him in a trap. Finally, the Gangnam District C was formed, and the man asked who would take Beelzebul's left arm. Naturally, the only one fit for the job was Han Taizan, their S-rank Fist King. The angry man was shocked to hear this and wondered why they had not seen such a powerful king until now. They had a trustworthy source that said that the Fist King would surely return from his training within an hour. On top of that, the gate that he would return from would open in Gangnam. Of course, there was no such trustworthy source. This was just from Hyunwook's memory. He had seen it over and over in the report of the Sill Wave, so he knew exactly when the player would appear and where. The records of the Fist King, who single-handedly continued to fight against the King of Hell. Thanks to that, the sergeant now had a lot of information concerning the King of the Underworld. Then, the smaller man said that he wanted the big guy to take care of the bombardment with him. The commander immediately agreed, though he was worried about whether this was okay. The Wicked Guildmaster was quite known around these parts for being sneaky and behind. Yet, if it were a friend, what if it were a man under the bus to achieve what he wants? Sure, right now the villain's plans made sense, but that was only until they had let their guard down. Lee Hunwook did not trust Kyoyong, and he had considered all that while making a plan, which was why he had put the Confusion A rank hero in the same category as himself, if just so that he could keep an eye on that noisemaker. Then the strong commander placed a hand on Hyunwook's shoulder, calling him by name, before saying his apologies as his voice shook slightly. The big guy felt terrible for putting all these burdens on the Bluinet, but the hero just smiled. Hywook reassured the commander that he already had so many opportunities to grow through all of this, and this wave was the one that he would try his best to defeat. These words helped the big tiger commander to smile with confidence. Then, the big guy called for his team to fire everything. Everything was indeed charged up into a big and beautiful glowing ball, and they hurled that thing and many more beams at the monster's parts that were peeking out of the sky. All those yellow sparks of energy found their mark as they were launched into the air, and they blossomed out on their target like flowers in a garden. More and more attacks were rained on this demonic beast, but it did not even slightly flinch. While this was happening, the Sergeant Lee Hunwook called together the platoon leader and told them to take Kim Si-hee and Private Kim Kyunjin and move to Point P. They understood the command, and Team B began to move immediately. More and more bomb flowers blossomed to distract the team as they got moving. The bombs continued to fire, and his team advanced, but the sergeant still had work to do. He and team leader Chu would move closer to the gate. The sergeant warned his boys to stay silent. If they were to make any noise, that was the end of them. Plus, there were a lot of monsters nearby, so they had to move very quietly. Suddenly, the guild leader chuckled that it made sense that there were a lot of monsters in the area, and he signaled to his big green thing associate, who grinned at its summoner. Lee Hunwook paused when he noticed a hesitation from team leader Chu. However, before the hero could do further investigating, one of Kyoyong's bodyguards suddenly attacked him, smashing him to the ground, and the ugly old man laughed. He planned to say that the show-off F-rank soldier died in battle after one strike during the mission. It was all so unfortunate, but the ugly A-ranker did not mind. Meanwhile, the F-ranker actually pushed out of the rubble by himself suddenly, muttering about how much he hated getting stabbed in the back, and Kyoyang could only just stare in mortified shock. Yes, the ugly old rat had moved exactly the kind of way that Lee Hyun-wook had expected him to move. However, the youth also warned the ugly old man that he would never get away with it. 1 month ago, at the Bundango Park gate, a man trembled in fear. This is because they were under attack from some very fearsome bear-like monsters. The man was also and could not possibly fight these creatures by himself. Suddenly, the bears got knocked out right in front of him, and a whole band of ogres moved in to knock out each of the bear monsters one by one. The wicked guild leader smirked with joy because he loved to use human bait to lure out the monsters that he was trying to hunt. There was nothing better to get monsters to gather. The bait was relieved to see that he had survived to see his team leader and was just about to thank him when he got slapped and tossed aside. The leader growled that human bait was the best, but it was so annoying to him when so many people watched. The big green ogres hurriedly got rid of the monsters. However, as they fought, the boss monster, the lava bear, appeared, and the lava bear was a big alpha red bear that moved to secure its territory. The guild leader then scoffed that he did not care at all about the stupid bear's territory, and he was interested instead in the bear itself. The giant bear was furious as it was pained down by many of those ogre warriors. The big red bear was infuriated and tried to charge at the pompous player, but the man then immediately activated his monster breaking, a teamer skill. He could gain control of monsters by taking their hearts, and the monster's consciousness was fading. As the beast struggled, the player then stretched out his hand to create golden markings down the beast's chest. The monster breaking had been successful despite the red bear's struggles, and the ugly old man grinned as he held that golden heart in his hand. He then quickly pocketed it, of course, and now his dominance training began. The monster would not have to accept the skill caster as its master. Finally, the big red bear bowed in defeat as Kyoyang took over its heart, mind, and soul. In the hero's past life, the ugly Chu Kyoyang had led a monster that rivaled the mid-sized guilds. That horrible man was regarded as the A-rank player who was the closest to becoming an S-rank player. However, after the Sil wave was over, nobody had been able to find him. According to the records, a necromancer, quite similar to the one that they had defeated earlier, who was able to control a monster army, appeared after Kyoyang disappeared. Now, Lee Hyun-wook could not help but wonder how those were related, and if Chu Kyoyang would eventually awaken as a necromancer. Well, none of that mattered right now, because the guild player had just betrayed them. That stingy, selfish maniac had been willing to risk their survival just so that he could hug all the glory, and he planned to pretend that the sergeant had fallen in battle. The man pushed to his feet and asked the guild player if he really thought that he would get away with that. The guild leader was shocked as he had been really sure that he would get away with it. The sergeant was not supposed to survive that very first attack after all. Then, the hero quickly activated some metal bending and got busy cutting down the foes around him. The man then leapt up and yelled at the cowardly guild leader. He could already guess that the evil man had killed all the other A-rankers just like this too. Then, Hyun-wook asked if that had been ordered by Great Mountain, or if it was all just part of the man's greedy desires. The gathered monsters stood, ready to go at the command of their wicked master, and Kyoyang stood there as he reassessed his option for a moment. Then he smirked, asking if the hero really thought that he could handle him alone. The man was ugly, but he had risen through the ranks due to his amazing power, and it was nothing to sneeze at, especially since he mostly had his monsters do the fighting for him, so he barely ever got a scratch. Chu Kyoyang was not the kind to be held back by his affiliation like a soldier. However, the ugly villain was a little irritated that the hero seemed to know way more than he should, and that really pissed him off. So naturally, Hyun-wook had to die no matter what. The monsters then all rushed over, determined to cut the hero down. They did not have time to waste on a useless battle like this when they were all prepping to battle the beast. However, the hero stood his ground, and the ogre swung down in rage and anger. The two fighters dashed by each other as they fought, and the metal bender leapt at the other gathered monsters, taking them down one by one. It was a lot of monsters to deal with, but he skipped by most of them, arriving at the center of the target he desired most of us, the ugly and wicked redhead Kyoyang. The hero would just have to beat Kyoyang's intentions out of him since the guild player was so bad at answering questions. The leader looked shocked by how close the hero had almost come to hurting him. However, Hyun-wook's attack was blocked, and the sergeant growled in annoyance. A hand had come to hold his weapon in a standstill. It turned out that the ugly leader could fight just fine, even if he did not have monsters at his beck and call. The monsters were just a convenience, that was all. The monsters raged, using the hero's moment of distraction to launch an attack from the back, a very cowardly move. It was the giant red bear that the ugly backstabber had worked hard to recruit, and it was about to slice Hyun-wook up. However, despite the creature coming, the sergeant did not move from trying to barrel through Kyoyang's defenses, so a part of his arm got caught in the monster's claws. The giant creature could easily swing its mighty paw and shatter rocks within seconds, and it was truly a fearsome beast. The hero had to slide away after all, giving the evil guild leader some distance. The hero had not seen any special abilities from Choi Yong besides his monster control until now, so he had to be careful on how he attacked this evil person. Clearly, Choi Yong was not above using dirty tricks, and now the sergeant wondered if the guild player was only able to control monsters because he had not awakened yet. If that was the case, then it was rather concerning. There was also the possibility that the guild player was not the necromancer. There were too many unanswered questions concerning this scenario. Meanwhile, Kyoyong was also rather pissed at all the unanswered questions surrounding the Bluinet. The man was clearly not an F ranker, not with that much strength, and he asked why the hero was acting like such a loser. Meanwhile, Hyunwook had other things on his mind. The necromancer, who was an out-of-level growth character, had quickly grown in notoriety due to their explosive growth. That meant that Chu Kyoyong had to know about the growth potential of F ranks. However, the guild player was having an entirely different type of conversation, telling the hero that if he was trying so hard to kill him by going as far as to hide his real rank, then there was really something to the soldier that he just tried to murder. It was gonna feel like a job half done if he just killed him, so he wanted Hyunwook to spill everything with an arm gone too. It seemed the wicked guild leader planned on collecting a heavy toll, including all the information that the hero knew, as well as his death. So, the guild leader pulled out a weapon, and the hero's eyes widened in shock. That thing that the A-rank player had just put in the Red Bear's hand was clearly a fragment of Mowgli as well. This was despicable work, and the bear brought that scary weapon down, shattering the ground and all who stood on it and around it. There was a huge explosion from that area because those two idiots were busy fighting themselves instead of the monster that they came to slay. The hero was then attacked by the horde of ogres again. It seemed that Kaoyong had no intention of holding back as he just wanted Hyunwook to be crushed. The monsters did indeed shove him into the floor, and it looked for a second like they were really going to crush him. Then, the guild leader commanded his beasts to cut the hero, and they were just about to do that when the hero panicked, saying that he had information regarding the villain's quest. He also had key information regarding the King of Hell that was required to clear that quest. It was interestingly the first time in a while that the hero had found himself pleading like this. The man was pressed to the ground, and he waited for his enemy to take the bait. If the guild leader was the villain, then Hyunwook was sure that this information would be appealing to him. Well, the guild leader took a moment to consider the villain quest, and he asked what that was. Now this was absolutely shocking news to the hero, who had not considered the possibility that Kaoyong was not a villain and was just in fact a bum who loved to oppress people. In truth, there was no point to the guild leader lying that he was not the villain, because the villain alliance did not really care what they had to do to achieve their goals. This could only mean that Kaoyong was truly not a villain or a necromancer. This was also confusing to the hero as he could not fathom why a non-villain would act shamelessly like a jerk for no reason. The hero asked in anger why the guild leader was killing people, and why they were getting in the way of conquering this wave. Now, this made Kaoyong smile, and of course, the greedy jerk said that it was obviously because he really thought that he could tame the King of Hell and finally rise in ranks to become an S-ranker. The guildmaster had told the man to do what he wanted, so he had no reason to stand back. That meant that he had no reason to stop the descent as long as he could take the king for himself. At the end of the day, it was about pride, ambition, and a lot of overwhelming arrogance. Man was out here feeling sure that he could somehow tame the devil, and the hero cursed at the awful dude. Hyunwook was so pissed at his enemy for being such a lousy villain, saying that he should at least have a proper reason for dooming all of humanity. Yet, this jerk was out here just killing people because they were in his way. Now the sergeant was twice as infuriated, and the guild leader chuckled, seeing no reason why he should do otherwise. All the players and all the monsters were busy killing each other in this insane world, so why should he not take the opportunity to kill whatever he liked? That seemed reason enough to a selfish man like Kaoyong. The hero was sure of it now. There was no more reason to probe. This greedy jerk was definitely not the necromancer, and the sergeant activated his own Mowgli release. The giant sword materialized before them, slicing right through the red bear that bellowed in pain and rage. The guild leader jumped back in shock, staring at that giant sword that had come out of nowhere. With Koyong distracted, the hero activated the fail knot, and the arrow shot into the eye of the monster, holding him down. The hero was really upset, and he unleashed attack after attack from Mowgli to fail knot, and then even the spear of Achilles. The monsters screamed and shouted as they got electrocuted. Cloudblade has also been activated, and the dark hand of the Cloud Master finished those monsters off immediately. The monsters howled in agony, but there was nothing to be done for their pain. They were trapped. Then the man stood there with the spears dancing around him. As he stood above the guild leader, his expression etched in rage and anger. The guild player was shocked as he stared at Hyunwook, cursing at him but also wondering just what the heck he was. The angry sergeant glared back and called Kyoyong trash, who could not be the necromancer. He did not need a pig like that with no information. Thus began an epic beatdown with lots of flashbangs. The beatdown was so epic that it happened off-screen. Meanwhile, a hero stepped out of a portal, a traveling bag on his back, and he looked around in confusion, wondering where his house had gone, since it had been replaced by suspiciously familiar-looking rubble. This enraged the hero, and he turned with anger towards the monster that dared destroy his house. Meanwhile, the soldiers were still at the ready, and they loaded up the second line, Holy Cannon Reload. They also loaded up the second line Reload and wondered if they truly could break through that monster's hand. They had been shooting energy balls for ages, and it did not seem to make a dent. Suddenly, the soldiers' attention was drawn to something above, and they all looked up in awe to see an angry hero flying right at the monster in the sky. It was indeed a rather audacious thing to do, and they watched in awe as this person fired right at the giant hand in the sky, actually blasting a hole through it. This was a shocking development to the onlooking soldiers, and they gaped. It was an explosion so huge and formidable that it could be seen from miles, and the angry handsome hero landed, growling that the monster broke his house, so now he was going to break it. The sky lit up in brilliant lights of electric blue. Hyunwook looked menacing, lit up by that glow, and he glared down at the guild leader, who was quite shocked at the monster that he was facing. The hero had confirmed now that a piece of trash like Kyoyong could not possibly be the necromancer, so he had no need for a pig with no useful information. Kyoyong was a little shocked by this new display, then lowered his head with a little chuckle, saying that it was really cute. It seemed that he had been taken for a fool, and he did not like that at all. The hero was confused at this reaction, and then he leapt back just in time as something rather demonic suddenly appeared. It looked much like a chain ascending from the ground, and it was ridiculously long. The hero just managed to dodge it. The hero gritted his teeth, wondering just when the guild leader had the time to summon such a beast. That thing was too big to get so close without making any noise. It was a really ugly monster with many long chain-like tentacles, definitely something out of a nightmare, and the hero leapt back. Imagine how amazing it would be if they could use that monster on the demon instead of fighting against themselves. The piggy called out to the soldier boy, telling him to observe why the world thought he was as powerful as a medium-sized guild. The long monster extended to concerning heights as it danced around the surrounding area, but our guy just managed to dodge it. However, he could not focus on that monster alone as yet another ogre manifested, and this one was even uglier than the ones that he had been dealing with earlier. The creature attempted to crush him, but fortunately, Hyunwook dodged out of the way. The monster roared in anger and raised its huge club, leaping after its smaller target, intending to do damage. The club was spiked too, so that would hurt a lot if it hit, even with hardening. Suddenly, the long chain erupted right through the ogre, spilling its guts everywhere, even though they were supposed to be fighting for the same team. The chain had used the ogre as a distraction and launched at the sergeant, who just managed to dodge that too. It seemed that both people and monsters were just disposable tools to the guild master Kyoyong, and that really pissed Hyunwook off. However, he really had to deal with that annoying chain creature and its many tentacles. Even as the man was fighting that, more monsters popped up out of nowhere, and bulls controlled by Kyoyong came into play. This was a ridiculous amount of enemies being wasted on someone who was not the king of hell, and those monsters were ferocious too. It was such a pity. The chain monster was doing way more damage to its own people than it did to the hero, though, and its brash attacks helped Hyunwook level the playing field to some degree. It would have been wiser to launch that ugly chain creature after the other monsters had at least dealt proper damage to their opponent. With every creature attacking like this, there was no coordination. Kyoyong was a powerful A ranker, but he did not have a lot of battle sense at all, the way he was just tossing aside useful pawns. Well, the hero found an opening to summon his Mogle shard to himself, and Kyoyong walked around since he had nothing better to do. The pig leader noticed a satchel on the floor, so he grabbed it, muttering that the army was a joke with a lot of lies these days. They said that the man he'd be going with was an F rank, so Kyoyong had expected the sergeant to at least be C rank. Yet this man was somehow managing to overwhelm the stampede of monsters that were trying to kill him. That was rather embarrassing to Kyoyong. This weirdo had shredded his orc and ogre armies without a second's thought. Obviously, no simple F-rank soldier could achieve that, but the chain monster remained in the game at least, though it suffered some damage. The sergeant was even somehow managing to block the tentacles of one of the strongest ancient beasts, the Jacalopterus. A beast that would have killed an F-ranker in an instant. The guild leader was quite annoyed by this display of power, reasoning that the fighter was probably at least an A-rank hero. He had thought that it was weird that a weakling had so much sway in the military. So, this had happened because this weakling was not weak at all. The pig leader cursed at the military, but he was still the epic Chu Kyoyong, and he was not scared of their sleeper agent strong fighter. A single A-rank soldier would not be able to withstand the might of a man like the beast tamer, and the man called out for all of his monsters to assemble. The monsters did indeed assemble like a messed up version of the Avengers, and they raced at the hero, who noted their approach. The monsters were ferocious, carrying the anger of the one who summoned and controlled them. They were vast in number. It was more than just a 10 versus 1 battle. The gathered beasts numbered almost to 100 and none of them were slackers in strength. It was rather concerning. Then the beast tamer laughed as he got the chance to show them firsthand why they called him the A rank closest to being an S rank. Kayong was really proud of that particular title, and he was going to make the hero struggle against his sea of monsters. The hero was quite annoyed to see that Kyoyong had called forth all the monsters that he controlled. The wisest thing to do would be to lead all the monsters towards the beast that they were trying to attack so that they could get some hits in. Even the hero had no intention in fighting every single one of these summoned monsters when he had bigger fish to fry. So, the man decided that he would go for the kill. The guild leader saw the man coming and laughed, impressed that the fighter was not stupid after all. He really thought that he could end all this by getting him, the commander of all the summoned beasts. It was not an incorrect deduction. The question was what would block the hero's way. Kyoyong was, of course, not going down without a fight, but a man-to-man battle was exactly the way Henwook preferred to do things. He used his metal bending to block off the attacks that the ugly pig shot in his direction. The two struggled even as those tentacles grew closer, aiming to add an advantage to Kyoyong's fighting style. The man laughed, asking if the hero thought that the beast tamer had gotten this far just because he could control a few monsters. It was more than just a few monsters, but the pig called the hero an idiot all the same. The hero called the pig an idiot, as he clearly knew nothing about how to control Mowgli. Well, that worked in the sergeant's favor, and his own bigger Mowgli descended from the sky to drop on the annoying Kyoyong. The man had to abandon any chance of fighting the hero, using his hands to stop the sword from crushing him. This left the guild master open to attack. The hero would be foolish not to take advantage of the situation. However, Hyunwook said that what he aimed for was not Kyoyong. Sir Tristan's failnaught was then activated, and the man's eyes widened when the arrow slipped into the pouch bag on his waist. The hero snatched the bag instead of killing the beast tamer, and he looked pretty proud of himself too. The beast tamer was at least infuriated about that and yelled at the hero for daring to lay his hands on his packages, even ordering the sergeant to return them immediately. The man smirked, saying that he knew well what he held, and that it was the inventory bag of all of the monster's hearts that he had collected. Now things were going better than expected. He did not need to hurt the wielder if he could just steal the weapon. The guild leader was horrified that the man had him by the bag, and he tossed aside that mighty sword, obviously willing to fight to the death to get that bag back. For some reason, their hero still stood within sight, posing. If they were to release that bag, hundreds of monsters would immediately go on a rampage and they would both die. Now Kyoyong was trying to reason with him, how admirable. The hero, however, knew quite well that he would not be the target of these monsters if he were to release the bag. In fact, he was sure that all of the monsters present probably had a lot to settle with the pig guild leader first. They were all looking at him rather menacingly, too, the promise of pain glowing in their eyes. This was even better than just finishing the trash guild leader off with his own hands. Kyoyong panicked, telling the hero to be realistic. Obviously, they could not take down the king of hell without the beast tamer and his monsters. The hero said that he could try, after all. It would be a pain to work with someone who had a track record of stabbing other people in the back. The guild pig got angrier and angrier, cursing the hero for lying about being an F rank, and that it was in human nature to lie, cheat and deceive. Well, Hyunwook thought that he was talking straight nonsense, and that lying and being a terrible person was not all there was to being human. Not everyone was like the selfish guild pig. The man held open the hearts. He was being really dramatic with it, too. The beast tamer screamed in defeat, but all of those hearts came soaring down, and Kyoyong was instantly killed by the tentacle monster. He had been so focused on the bag that he did not even try to defend himself. Well, the guild pig was trapped by the tentacle beast that looked like it had a lot to say, and the beast tamer cursed in rage, cursing the beast for going again at its master. Well, Kyoyong had not been a very kind master, and each of his slaves wanted to lodge an official complaint about that. The hero did not mind, he left them to it, and the beast tamer spat blood as those monsters beat him up. There was so much blood and gore that the hero had to leap away to avoid getting splashed. Well, that was that, and he stood there, looking around. The Mowgli fragment, hero grade, had the mass seal and release, and it granted a sturdy constitution to the user. Now, the hero had also obtained Kaoyang's Mowgli fragment, and he glared at the ugly pig, thinking that it was a fitting death for someone who treated lives like they were nothing, and a stranger hero had done significant damage to the king's hand, since it had dared to destroy his house. The strange hero had already made a significant hole in the monster's arm, and the stranger explained that he did not like to drag things out, so he would end things in one go. He was really talking to the arm like it was an independent entity. As the man approached the arm that protruded from the glowing holes, the soldiers below recognized the skill from the S-rank Fist King, Han Tae-san. They were shocked as a large explosion was made when the hero made contact with the monster's arm. The stranger stared in surprise as something had appeared out of nowhere to block the damage. How bothersome! Another super handsome villain had appeared, and it launched an attack at the stranger, punching the surprised man in the face. This sent the fist hero flying to the ground in a huge explosion, and the man kept going. The force of that punch was so great that the man broke buildings as he fell. Then, a warning came up that the King of Hell had unlocked the first of his 3 thought forms. This dude was out here fighting them with the power of his imagination, but this imagination was kind of hot. The winged creature was a manifestation of the king, and he was strong enough to knock down the fist hero. This form was Pride, and it had revealed itself to the world with blazing red eyes, long elf ears, and a very strong jawline. That's it for this episode. Until next time!